It's Radio Free 501c, the voice of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm Cecilia Sapp. Don't forget to subscribe. We're on your favorite service. This week I'm joined by longtime friend and colleague Dar Conte, CAE of Hill Staffer, and we're going to be talking about Hill Day impact after the visits. Welcome to episode 207. Hey everybody, it's Monday, August 21st. Can you believe it? Summer's almost over, but not quite. Welcome to this week's episode of Radio Free 501c. I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp. I am the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting, and I'm a CAE, Certified Association Executive, and a CNP, which is a Certified Nonprofit Professional. We're wrapping up August with 2 episodes about legislative activity and how to fit those into your strategy well and provide good member support and engagement. This week, I am finally welcoming back, after I think 2.5 years, my friend Dar Conte of Hill Staffer, and we're going to be talking about increasing the impact of your Hill Day event. But before we dive into that, to our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be, and thanks for listening. So, Anne, welcome back to the show. It's been too long. Would you like to say hello and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hey, Cecilia, thanks so much for having me. And greetings to all of the audience, no matter where you are. I am coming to you from warm and humid Raleigh, North Carolina. But I think it's warm and humid everywhere these days. So I'm very happy to be with you today and looking forward to discussing the strategic approach to advocacy that I generally take with my clients.
Oh, this is great. And fun fact, I don't know if a lot of people know this and may not remember this either, but I actually used to be a lobbyist in the early part of my career many years ago. So I always love talking about legislative activities and issues. So Hill Day is always fun. Now, where I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, we had a neighborhood called the Hill, which were the descendants of all the immigrants from Italy, and they used to have a Hill Day, but it was nothing like what we mean when we say a legislative Hill Day. So let's talk about that. So, Anne, can you explain for the audience, because a lot of people in our profession don't really do the advocacy and legislative activities, or maybe they're at a C3 that doesn't do that because it's really not part of what they do. So can you explain a little bit about what a Hill Day is and how it can be helpful?
Sure, Cecilia, but first I want to tell you that the Hill Days I'm talking about don't generally have calzones as part of the event. I kind of like the sound of the one that you mentioned. So in short, I mean, a Hill Day is called a Hill Day. It's also called a fly-in or legislative summit or legislative day, depending upon who's doing it. And in essence, a Hill Day is an advocacy tool where it is basically a means of engaging members by having them engage with legislators or other policymakers, generally here in the US, as either in Congress or in state capitals. Traditionally, Hill Days have been in-person events where people from all over the community impacted by the organization come to either Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional offices, or in state capitals, they come there to meet with their legislators. And it's generally constituency based. So if you live in a legislator's district, you want to use the fact that you vote for those people or vote in their district as the way to match to their people. And they're often a 2 or 3 day event where there is education about the issues, education about how to be a good advocate. Good programs also, in my mind, bring people in after their meetings and make sure that they kind of debrief and talk about what they're going to do when they go back to the district to develop that relationship. But a Hill Day is really a means to an end. It's an event that is intended to help your people develop those good constituent relationships with their decision makers on public policy issues that impact the organization, so that the organization can move the needle towards positive policy outcomes.
Wow. And that is a great definition of that and what the purpose of it is. So that's great. What can you explain a little bit, Anne, what might happen at a Hill Day or a fly-in event?
Sure. A Hill Day is generally, like I mentioned, a 2 to 3 day event. So people oftentimes they will come together in a kind of meet and greet. You often the night before the event typically starts, and people can kind of get to know each other and then maybe go off on their own for dinner. Um, then they'll usually is a day of training where they will bring in expert trainers, or sometimes the staff themselves will talk about the issues. They may bring in members of Congress or other legislators or their staff, and maybe they might talk about the best way to make an impact. Staff on the Hill, on Capitol Hill in DC are an especially good group of people to bring in and have them talk about the role of staff, the importance of staff, and why interacting with the staff can be so instrumental in developing the relationship with the office and therefore the elected official. You will also have bring officials in maybe to speak at a dinner that you're doing or at a lunch. And generally, you might want to look at a member, an elected official who is a committee chair of a critical committee for you, or somebody who has been a longtime champion, not somebody who just votes for your issues, but somebody who's willing to carry the torch for you. And then what you do is you send folks out to prearranged meetings, and you may or may not have other people from the staff with them, so that they can assure that they're speaking off the same song sheet or talking points that are provided. And then in my mind, a really good Hill Day brings people back to debrief, because I think one of the things that happens is people see their meeting as the way they're all done, and then they get surprised. They might go to Capitol Hill in DC and say, and this, you've been on the Hill. They don't realize how small the offices are. They don't realize how young the staff are. They might talk about, we have to train them not to talk about the money that they gave them in their election campaign. You don't want to discuss those things. You don't want to comment on the youth of them. So you want to kind of give them etiquette, but then also have them come back and share their great stories with others and show people that a Hill visit can happen in many different ways. It could be, hey, the member himself or herself dropped in. Wasn't that fun? And we got to take some pictures. Or we had to actually go meet in the hallway because there were so many people around today. So we actually held our meeting in the hallways. So people also, in my mind, should be trained on what to do with that relationship that they're just beginning to have, not just in the Hill Day, but when they go back to their districts, so that they can actually develop and cultivate a relationship where the legislator actually stands by you and supports your issues on a regular basis.
So that's an interesting point about when you go back, because of course, most people don't live in the Washington, D.C. area. So if you're doing federal lobbying, you're probably not going to get there as often as you might be able to get to your state capital. Mm-hmm. But how do you manage maintaining relationships with staff when the federal office staff is probably different from the local office staff?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you schedule a meeting for a Hill Day in the DC office, oftentimes, one of the things that happens is first they confirm that you are a constituent. So that's really important. So there are so many requests for meetings that they really meet with people who are in the district, and they want to make sure that they are constituents. So they will confirm that, and they'll almost always ask for an address in that. So they can confirm that. But what happens is they might call the district office or the state office if it's U.S. Senate, and say, do we know this person? Have we seen them before? Oh. Do they receive our newsletter? And that way you are a known entity. And that's part of why you have a Hill Day. It's not to just have that what I call the first date, but to actually have a relationship. You want to be known to them. You want to be somebody they say, oh, look, Cecilia's coming to town. Let's make sure we make time for Cecilia, because she works with us year round and she's always such a good and trusted and respected source of information on her issues. So let's make sure we put time aside for Cecilia.
So that's a great explanation of how you can maintain that ongoing, even though you might be dealing with two different groups of staff. And I think that's something a lot of people might overlook. And I think it's also difficult, and maybe you have some thoughts on this. I think it's difficult to maintain that momentum with your member. So your member comes to Washington, D.C. for the Fly-In Hill Day visit event. They're excited, they're seeing their fellow members, they're learning things they might not have known, they're getting to see the Capitol and how it actually works. But then they go home and maybe they lose that momentum. So how can you keep that momentum going?
That's a super duper question, because I really believe that if you are not giving them a 365-day a year member engagement on advocacy opportunity and the training that goes with that, then all you're doing is having that first date. And let me talk a little bit about that from a dating standpoint. Okay, I think it's pretty safe to say that every one of us who is listening has gone on a date or two in our lives. And what we do is we try to find the right partner. Okay, now we know if we are using a constituency-based meeting that we are talking to the right potential partner. And if our goal is to get a commitment, a first date is not a commitment. I know very few people, and I say very few because I do know 2 or 3 people who actually ask their spouse to marry them after a first date. But it's very rare, it's rare too. It's very rare that a commitment happens after a first date. So you can have a first date by going to dinner. You can have a first date by going for coffee, but it's all the subsequent dates. You want to go to the movies. You want to take them home to meet your parents. You want to go ahead and go away for a weekend. You want to buy them gifts or flowers. Now, I'm going to say very, very clearly, you never buy your legislators gifts. That's not part of the rules. The point I'm trying to make is that there are lots of ways to have dates so that you can develop the trust and the respect so that a committed relationship is possible. And what do we want in a committed relationship from our legislator or their office? We want to have an open door from them. We want to make sure that they hear our industry or profession's issues. We want to make sure that they understand the issues, and we want to respectfully agree to disagree if on 1 out of 10 issues they're not with us. And we want to, in the end, the really good relationship is when they come to you and say, hey, this issue about water conservation or about changes in the tax code are going to affect our people. I think they're going to affect your people, excuse me. And the legislator's office calls you and says, can we talk about this? You have then become their trusted confidant, their respected constituent, and they know that they can have an honest conversation. One of the things too is important to know when you are able to talk to them is they may ask you, what does the other side think of this? So be able to show them what the other side is saying and then give them facts. You should have fun, but you should always give them facts about what it is that you're about. So there are lots of ways that you can go back into the district, whether it's chapter meetings, regional meetings, town hall meetings. I talked about taking them home to meet your parents. The equivalent of that is take them to your work site. Show them how you do what you do. Where do you come from? That's a way of doing it. So there are a lot of ways that you can make sure that they're seeing you in the district with other people who to them are other voters, and having them give them the opportunity to meet with you there. Getting to know the staff is absolutely critical. And I would never underestimate the power of knowing the staff. The staff are the eyes and the ears for the members. Members can't be everywhere all the time, and their staff are their eyes and ears. So always be respectful and recognize the expertise and the hard work of the staff.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, especially the expertise of the Hill staff who work for our elected representatives, because they do usually have a focus, whether it's constituent relations or a specific issue, whether it's an environmental issue or a business issue. That's why they're meeting with you. It's not that you're unimportant. It's not that they don't want to meet with you, your representative. It's because they are one person with limited time in the day, like all of us. And so they're sending the best staff person.
Yep.
And one of the things people may see, because I've seen this when I have like participated in the ASAE Hill Day visits in the past, sometimes the staff might look a little bored or distracted. It's not that what you're saying is boring them or distracting them, but they have really crushing schedules. And so when they're meeting with you, they are probably meeting with a lot of other people in the same day. And so they're not trying to rush you out. They're just under a lot of pressure, like a lot of us, but their time
it's
is really, yeah.
Go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. It's just, yeah, their time is important, like all of our time is important, but they're usually pulled in several different directions at the same time. That sounds very similar to a lot of nonprofit management professionals. So when we keep that in mind too. So, especially if you are a first-time visitor to the Hill office, don't be offended. And if you do get to meet with your representative, even if they're just coming by to say, hi, nice to see you, and then going on to another meeting, is actually fun. There's a lot of fun to be had at a Hill Day. It's exciting to see how our government works. And I also just kind of want to mention, you had mentioned before about a 365-day plan for your members to keep up the work, keep up the contact, keep up that connection. And it really is a very high touch, high activity thing that you need to do. So, in my early career, when I worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I worked in policy and I was a lobbyist to a certain extent. I was not a senior lobbyist. I was kind of a junior lobbyist, but I was a lobbyist. And I even had to fill out a lobbying report. I had to file that back in the old days. But we would go up to the Hill as staff and we would distribute letters. We would walk around and stop in, drop off a letter. So there's a lot of high touch things going on from the National Association on behalf of the members, in addition to when the members come up and visit and send letters. And you may remember this too, because we're about the same age. Remember telegrams? We would send all those Western Union telegrams.
And faxes that faded in the sunshine.
That's right. Thermal paper. You gotta love it. But the thing is, the tools may change. We may do emails now. We may do online letters, which I think are great because you can go look up, what's my congressman? Here's my zip code. I can find out who that is. Or I know exactly who my senators are, and I can just send them these online communications. And, to me, that's very similar to the old telegrams, because the more of those they get, the better. So, that reminds me, Anne, as a lot of people know, I also offer courses on nonprofit management education. So one of the things I do talk about in these courses is advocacy. And one of those things is coalition building. So is there ever a place for a coalition to do a Hill Day together?
Yes, is the short answer. And coalitions, especially for organizations with small budgets, are a very effective tool for in your advocacy program. That's a tactic. Okay. So you have to always decide, as we talked about earlier, the strategic approach you're going to take. And then there are tactics that you want to add to that. And one of those tactics is the use of coalitions. Coalitions, for those who may not know, are groups of like-minded organizations that have a policy goal that they share in common. And it's kind of a three musketeers, all for one and one for all mentality, where you can broaden your reach. You may, for example, have members only in certain parts of the country, but other coalition members have them in other parts of the country. And therefore, your reach is much broader to the range of legislators and policymakers and decision makers who are impacted by or making decisions on your issues. So coalitions are a very low cost opportunity that should always be used in a program. It's important to be active coalition members. Some coalitions are free, actually. Others do have a pay to play kind of a scenario, but they often have a range of payment schedules so that the smaller organizations and the larger organizations can all be part of the same group. So it's important to understand those differences too. So yeah, coalitions are good. One of the things I mentioned earlier is strategy and tactics. And I think you are pretty well aware of Sun Tzu, the military strategist of like the 5th or 6th century, and the author of what many know as the Art of War. And one of the quotes that I like to use in helping clients look at their program is, don't start. One of the things I find is they start looking at tactics and they pull these tactics out of the sky and hope that by putting them all together, they're going to make something worthwhile. And just like it's no way to bake a cake, you don't just throw some sugar and some cinnamon and some flour and some eggs and hope you get a good cake. You have to start out with a recipe. And the recipe is your strategic approach. Sun Tzu puts it this way: strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Therefore, if you want to win, you have to create strategy. If you put no tactics or the wrong tactics behind it, it's going to take you a long time to get to that victorious place. Well, in our business, time is money. So you want to be effective in the use of how you approach things. If you are, as I mentioned earlier, just throwing a bunch of tactics together and hope it adds up to something exceptional, that's the noise before defeat. So I think it's really important that we always look at the strategy and tactics piece.
Oh, I agree. I am so glad you brought that up. And that is one of my favorite Sun Tzu quotes, because I also think that's one that's easily accessible for a broad audience, because it's very clear about you can't do one without the other, and one isn't successful without the other. And the way I summarize the entire book, if you're not familiar, audience members, with The Art of War, it's one of my favorite books, has been for most of my adult life. Sometimes people will say, oh, you and that Art of War stuff that you do, because I do talk about it quite a lot. But the thing about that book, there's 13 chapters and each chapter has a different lesson. But overall, you can summarize The Art of War this way: it is about finding opportunities. And that is what having a Hill Day is about in a lot of ways. That's a tactic as part of that larger strategy of finding those opportunities to get your message across to legislators and decision makers, and ultimately to the regulators who are going to decide how that law is going to be enforced. So that's really important too. Now, and we've been talking kind of like about what I consider the traditional Hill Day event, which is you go talk to your elected officials. But is there ever a place with a Hill Day event or a fly-in event where you do talk to the regulators, the people who write the rules for how the law is going to be enforced?
Yes. Also, a lot of people think about Hill Days and advocacy as legislative only. We look at things as public policy oriented. And that goes back to your very basic, how smart am I next to a 5th grader? We have the 3 branches of government, and legislation happens at the federal, state, and local levels. Regulation also occurs at all of those levels. And court and judicial proceedings also occur. And one of the trends I would say that we've seen now is that agencies are trying to legislate via rulemaking. And when that happens, we often see court cases that are determining that the agency may or may not have had the power to do what they're doing, or they may have had some of the power, but not all of the power. So it's always important to maintain relationships with regulators. As an example, I do some work in the financial services arena. So that's a very highly regulated profession, whether at the federal or the state level. And while some people look at regulators as the enemy, we shouldn't be looking at them that way. They too can be our partners. We all want to be successful. So if we look at these people as folks who are just, they've been given the authority to make sure that business is run in a way that protects the public as well as protects the license to operate of those who are running the businesses or industries or professions involved, that we go ahead and we recognize them as partners, that we talk to them as partners, that we not treat them in a negative or a condescending or in an angry way, but we talk about what are the concerns you're seeing? Here are the concerns we're seeing. Help us understand what you're seeing, because if you're not telling us, we don't know, and we can't then help our people fix that. You know, if there are a lot of industries that are self-regulated, and if that self-regulation is working well, then oftentimes agencies will stay out of that. But it's very important to do regulatory advocacy. That can be done if there are comments that are being requested on a proposed rule or regulation. You can have, as an industry, put out a letter that can be signed by your leadership. You can have your people sign a petition as a member of that organization or industry. You can encourage your people to send letters, comment letters. There's a lot of different ways that that can be done. But one of the things I think is important too is with regulators, you always want to make sure that practitioners who are highly knowledgeable of the intricacies are the folks talking to them. The lobbyists can be fabulous, but it's really the people who do that work on a day-to-day basis that are best to meet with the regulators. But yes, always think about a regulatory component in your advocacy strategy and program.
You know, and I'm glad that we discussed that a little bit, because I think a lot of times if you're not the hands-on government relations director, for example, you're not necessarily thinking about that because to your point you brought up earlier about strategy and tactics, in some ways legislation is the strategy and regulations are the tactics, because legislation is what we're trying to do and the regulations is how we're going to do it. And that's really that big difference there. So we've talked about what a Hill Day is. We've talked about what might happen at Hill Day. We've talked about building those relationships locally and at the federal level. So before we wrap up, I think we've hit a lot of really good points on how to maintain that impact all year long, coming up with your 365-day plan. I wanted to ask you, is there much of a difference if you're having a Hill Day event at a state capitol as opposed to coming to Washington, D.C. and meeting with federal legislators? Is there anything different about that, or are they very similar?
I think in many ways, you just have to retrofit the formula into the state environment. And we have to remember what I think it was Justice Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said many years ago, and that is that the states are the laboratories of democracy, meaning that the states are the places where policy issues are often invented, for lack of a better word, and first carried out. And if they work there, then they might spread to other states. And then ultimately the feds might say, okay, we're seeing this happen in 20, 30 states, 40 states, maybe we need to adopt a single standard. But in the states, you'll see a couple of things happen. You'll see policy decisions made more quickly. So those ideas will become law more quickly than they might in the federal arena. Second is you've got a much greater opportunity to meet with the elected official themselves. Every state has a very different level of staffing. In some states, there really are no staff to support the members. In other states, like Florida, you have a very highly professionalized staff where you have year-round people working for the legislature. in the committees as well as in the members' office themselves. So it's really being able to recognize that some of the ways that things get carried out will be a little different, but for the most part, you can move it you can retrofit, as I said, that formula.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Because I do think we overlook that sometimes when we're members of a national association. We're not necessarily looking at what we could do at home where we are.
I think that's a really important point to be making. Very
excellent.
important.
So I want to make
The
sure.
other thing too, I would want to add, Cecilia, that we may not have chatted a lot about yet, which I think is critical, is that's the role of your CEO and your board. I am also a CAE, and one of the things that I try to do when I go into an organization and they say, what are we doing well in our advocacy program? What are we not doing so well? Is I often say to them, what's your CEO's perception of advocacy? Do they see it as an important priority? How about your board? Do they understand it? Do you engage them? What about your strategic plan? Is advocacy part of it, either as a particular goal or as one of the tactics that they say we need to use advocacy in our ability to achieve our other goals? And then communications and membership. Is your membership development people using advocacy as one of the member values? Is your communications department strategy coordinated with your advocacy strategy so that you're getting added value? And how are you doing all those things? How are you putting all your pieces together? Mm-hmm. Because if you're siloing your organization and your volunteer leadership hasn't bought into this and aren't going to be the best ambassadors for your program, then you probably are not going to get the resources you need or the engagement that you need, and and you're probably not going to be able to achieve success. And when you're asked, why can't we get this done? I want to go back to those foundational things and think about that.
That's, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it does need to come from the top. And especially if we don't want those silos built up, that also has to come from the top. But you're absolutely right, because the board of directors is the one who sets direction. So they're going to be setting those advocacy policies. And we're using the term advocacy here. Some people say government relations, but advocacy is the act of reaching out to people and sharing your message about what you do and why it's important. So even if you're a C3, you can do advocacy. Absolutely. And yes, okay, especially shout out to Erin Costello, my friend who does state relations. Yes, I know, Erin, 501c3s can lobby. I have this argument a lot, but
I get asked that all the time.
Yeah, and they can, and you can even report yourself if you're a C3 to the IRS if you've gone a little too far in your lobbying. If you're worried, you can send them a report and say, we actually did some lobbying, not advocating. Absolutely. Everybody can advocate, but not everybody can lobby.
Correct.
These rules. So let's keep that in mind too. So yes, your C3 can go up to the hill and talk about what you do and why it's important. You cannot support a candidate. You can't have a PAC. You can't ask them to vote yes or no on a piece of legislation.
You can't be political,
but right.
You can educate and advocate. And if the tool you're using is grassroots, you can use that. If the tool you're using is grass tops, you can use that. If the tool you're using is direct lobbying, you can use that. There are a lot of ways you can use it. But one of the problems people also mistake, this is where your board needs to be properly educated. Sadly, sometimes even CEOs need to be properly educated.
That's true.
Government relations is not synonymous with lobbying. I find sometimes an organization will have a lobbyist on staff and they think they have an advocacy program. They do not. They have a lobbyist. They do not have a government relations program or an advocacy program. They have a lobbyist. And that is using one specific technique. And again, we go back to Sun Tzu, use all the possible tactics, create the strategy.
That's right. And, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, I think a lot of smaller groups do have that contract lobbyist. And so that's a contractor that you work with, you manage. Like maybe you might have an IT contractor. Why? Because they know about IT. You have a lobbyist for the same reason. They know what's going on. They know who the movers and shakers are, and they know exactly who to talk to move your issue forward.
But a good government relations consultant may not recommend lobbying because your issue may not be ready for lobbying yet. It, as I say, it may not be ready for prime time. So if you have a lobbyist and you're paying them X amount of money a year, and they go up to the Capitol Hill, whether it's in the state or at the federal level, and they lobby or educate on your issue, and at the end of the session they say, "Sorry, just wasn't your year. Sign me up next year. We'll get it done." Whoa! This goes back to our 365 days a year approach. Right. Let's get the issue ready for prime time so that when we actually are ready for lobbying, then adding a lobbyist is the right thing to do.
I'm so glad you said that. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I do know that you have to build the relationship before you make an ask of any kind. And that's basically when you'd bring the lobbyist in. It's like doing business development. You build a relationship before you make the ask. It's like doing donor development. If you have to build that relationship, you can't just walk into a room and say, "Yeah, hi, give us money." So it's the same thing. But
you also have to show a need for the issue or the legislation that you're looking for. You have to show a need to make it happen. You have to bring in the facts behind it. You have to show the data and the statistics behind it. And you have to make the case before you're ready to go to the lobbying side of it. That could be articles in the press, letters to the editor, hiring a university to do a study, having internal resources to do a study, getting your members out talking to people so that you're raising consciousness about the issue internally as well as externally. A lobbyist is an important part of an advocacy team, but not all issues are ready for lobbying.
That's right. Yeah, say that one more time.
Not all issues are always ready for lobbying.
There we go. Thank you. That bears repeating because I am with you on that. Because you do have to lay the groundwork. And again, your recommendation of a 365-day advocacy program is really spot on because it really has to be built over time. Like any relationship, like you use the analogy of a first date leading to a long-term commitment. And it's the same thing with any type of relationship. So I really appreciate you saying that. I think that's a really good example.
It's top down also. I mean, you know this, Cecilia. You help a lot of clients with strategic planning and strategic plans, as well as training new board members. I find when I train new board members, that is one of the places where they really don't understand the advocacy process. And they often start with government relations is synonymous with lobbying. No, it's a bigger issue than that. And so you see it, you have to get the advocacy component into the strategic plan. If it's important to the organization, if it's not, they ought not be doing it. But if every day issues are being discussed in policymaking bodies, whether it's legislative, regulatory, or in the courts. And, there's a saying, this in Washington, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's right.
I don't want to be on the menu. I want to be at the table, but I don't want to just be at the table. I want to be a knowledgeable, effective, respected, and trusted voice at that table. And so if your industry is being impacted by any one of the policy decisions being made, then you need to be at the table, being proactive.
Yes, and that is doing that communication chain. You mentioned letters to the editor, press releases, doing research studies, all of those things, building those relationships. Awesome summary. And we could probably go another hour, but we probably should wrap up this episode. Or what will Anne talk about next time she comes back? So it's been great having
Let
you
your
back.
readers help it. Let your listeners tell us what they want most.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. I'd love to do something on working effectively with a government relations or advocacy consultant.
Oh, that would be good.
Selecting a good one and working with them so that you get the maximum that you can to achieve your goals.
Sounds like a plan to me. We'll
See you
book
soon
it
again then.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be back. So, Anne, I like to ask my guests, what's the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And if they want to talk with you more about Hill Staffer and how Hill Staffer can help with this 365-day plan, what's the best way to get in touch?
Well, the last thought I would probably leave is we have started with the Hill Day, but we've touched on so many other issues and items. And I think that really the thing is I want to leave people with is, why are you having a Hill Day? And is it part of your 365-day strategic cross-functional approach? Is it the best use of your resources to do a Hill Day? Or should I be looking at the bigger picture and using other ways? Because Hill Day is a single tactic. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the thought I want to leave people with, because there's a reason we went from Hill Days to all of this other things. Mm-hmm. In terms of contacting me, I am an expert, a partner of Rogue Tulips, so they can get me through you. But also through Hill Staffer, which is the government relations consultancy I'm also engaged with, is Dar Conte, DARCONTE. So my first initial and last name at hillstaffer, one word.com. Dar Conte at hillstaffer.com. Love to hear your thoughts, whether you need help or not. Love to hear your thoughts. Love to speak at your event. Love to hear more about what you liked or didn't like about what I had to say.
No, that would be great. Yes, we're always encouraging comments. So
yeah, Cecilia, thank you for having me here today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, you're welcome, Anne. Always a pleasure to talk to you too. And I know sometimes our offline conversations go on 2 or 3 hours, depending on when the last time was we talked. So no, this has been fun for me because I used to do a lot of legislative work early in my career, and sometimes I miss it, but I do like to keep up, and I do think it's important.
I'm always happy to have you join me for any part of what we do.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. So, Anne and I have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. And again, next week's episode is going to also be about legislative activity and how to keep building that impact all year long. Our guest is going to be Mike Bober of the Pet Advocacy Network. So we'll be rounding out that August recess before our Congress people get back with 2 exciting episodes full of really good information that you can apply immediately. So that's it for this week. But if you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and the kind of work we do, check out our website and our services page. The website is roguetulips.com. If you don't see exactly what you had in mind or what you're looking for, let's talk, because those are just some of the things that we can do for you. If you are a nonprofit management professional or a volunteer at a nonprofit organization and you'd like to find some education, check out our education program. It is so big, it has its own website, the 501cleague.net, and our program is the 501c League, and we can help you get ready for a credentialing exam or prepare for an ethics requirement, depending on what it is you're looking for. Check that out as well. If you have questions, always feel free to contact me. So that's it for this week, and we'll see you next time.